Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. I remember many years ago in the early part of the 1970s growing up in western Texas, and I was simply attending school, and one day we decided the teacher took us all on a walking field trip to the local theater. It was there we sat down in the dark, and on the screen appeared a man wearing dark-framed glasses to let us all know that we would be now watching a movie that would extend beyond 3 hours. You know, think about being the age of 6 years old in a theater and someone telling you you're going to spend the next 3 hours watching a movie. And as the scenes unfolded, we realized that all of us were simply sitting there mesmerized, wondering, can this movie possibly go any longer? Because it certainly was exciting. This particular movie many people are familiar with, especially around Christian holidays, is simply known as the Ten Commandments. It is the life of Moses, and it is this that we became mesmerized, but then we found ourselves as we got older to realize there seems to be a lot of confusion about who Moses was. But even more considerate was to find the fact that a lot of the facts that seemed to be coming out to light was, how real was Moses? And in fact, in time, did the Exodus really occur? And if so, well, our guest today tells us there's the possibility, if not the reality, that Moses was murdered and that somebody simply took his place as an imposter. The book is The Murder of Moses. It's how an Egyptian magician assassinated Moses, stole his identity, and hijacked the Exodus. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, who is a librarian and co-author of the Atlantis Blueprint, who appeared on History Channel, Discovery Channel, NBC, CBS, and the BBC, as well as numerous radio shows. I'd like to welcome Rand Flemont to the Beyond 50 radio program. Rand, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Well, thank you for having me, Daniel. I appreciate it.
You know, it's pretty exciting because, as the producer says, here's something I think would be a really unique segment. I realized, I've actually approached this topic kind of twice in the early part of 2000s, which you actually talk about two people who I had met and interviewed, and that is both, of course, Bruce Feiler, Walking the Bible as well as Abraham, and Jonathan Kirsch, Moses Alive.
Oh, yes.
And what's really cool about that is this. I remember when I first met Jonathan Kirsch to talk about his book, he was telling me the story of how this all came about, that he began becoming interested in Moses by realizing, wait a minute, what's with this bloodthirsty God pursuing Moses after he's saying, look, lead the children, out of Egypt, the Israelites, and I'm thinking, whoa, what are we talking about? And what's unique is that from time to time you get historians, archaeologists, philanthropists, if you will, or not anthropologists, but you can probably call them philanthropists. They come out with these new things and new evidence, and you start scratching your head going, well, how come we buy so much, or at least most people, the devours, if you will, the Bible as it is. And it's like, maybe it's time we wake up and kind of look more into the matter. How did you become interested in this particular story?
I was reading mythology, which I do frequently, and in this book that I was reading, I came across reference to the death of Adab and Abu, who are Aaron's sons. Who they were responsible, just to give a background, for carrying the Ark of the Covenant, they and their two other brothers. And they would set up the Ark of the Covenant in the tent, set it where it was going to be. It was believed that God was inside the Ark. And then there was a screen around it, a veil around it. And then there was other places where there was for bathing, and then you put on this oil. So I heard this story about him. I read this story about how they came in and they offered. They were curious of what was going on, what was in there, and unbeknownst to Moses or Aaron, their father, they went into the temple, into the tent rather, tabernacle, and went beyond the veil, and they offered incense, and suddenly they were incinerated, just burnt to death. Now I thought, to me, this was such a strange thing that happened. why when these boys, young men, who were just curious, really, why should the cost of having curiosity be a horrible death? And then in comes Moses and Aaron, and Aaron starts to about to wrench at his clothes, which was the thing of that was what people did when they were in grief. And Moses says, "Don't do that, because you too have the oil on you." In other words, he could be incinerated too. And so that made me think, oh, that's an interesting thing. Was this really the act of the creator of the universe burning somebody because of curiosity, which seemed completely at odds to everything that I understood to be normal? Or was there something else going on? And so the next thing I did was I came across Jonathan Kirsch's book, and Moses, which is just a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it to anybody. And in there, I came across reference to Freud's Moses and Monotheism, and also Richard Elliott Friedman's, who wrote the Bible. And those two books then became kind of my guiding principle, and from there, being a librarian, I started to collect all the books I could. And I did this for nearly over 10 years. And I was collecting books and reading them. And as I read the story, the more it seemed to me that there was something more going on here than just meets the eye. So that's how I really got into it.
Yeah, I remember when I sat with him and he was telling me that it originally started because he decided to start reading sort of bedtime stories to his young son. And then all of a sudden, as he was reading this stuff, he's like, wait a minute. I think a lot of us had the impression of Moses. I think many of us actually, for the first time, like I did as the young boy, watching the Ten Commandments.
Oh, me too.
Yeah, So in a way, we can kind of follow this interview a little bit and kind of open things up, because although a lot of it was fantastical, so to speak, and even mythical, that when you begin to explore the truth, I noticed, especially when it comes to stories from the Bible, when you begin to explore the truth, to me anyway, that seems more interesting than the legend and the myth that's been put in there. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes, this is the thing. I believe that there's a subterranean story there, and it has been covered up. And if you remove certain layers, you can see something differently. And then also, if you bring into to bear on the story of Moses, Jewish folklore, and the reason that's so important is, for me, the Torah, much of the Torah is really a conflict between the house of Levi and the house of Joseph. And Joseph, of course, is the great hero of and the rags to riches story, and he and Levi were at odds. And this carries on all the way throughout the whole Torah, and then in history it carries on too, because initially there's a united kingdom. There's Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Now, Israel in the north had the 10 tribes that were loyal to Joseph, and then in Judah you had the Levites and Judah. Benjamin is kind of on the fence between the two of them, and unfortunately, what happened to the people who were telling the stories from the perspective of Joseph, when Israel was overrun by the Assyrians in 722 BC, they had to scatter, and a lot of them. This is the lost tribes of Israel. A lot of them went to Egypt. A lot of them, but a good deal of them went to Judah. And there, they couldn't really express their thoughts from the perspective of the house of Joseph. They had to suppress their stories, and in order to get their stories over, they did it orally, and that's where Jewish folklore comes into play, and is in my view, is another tool to look at the story of Moses, and you see something differently through that. It's most epitomized in my view in the story of the sapphire rod. In the story, Adam gives to his son this golden rod that God had given to him when he was expelled from Eden. And then it's passed on down through Noah, all the way through to Abraham, to Israel. Eventually it comes into the hands of Joseph. Joseph has it, and then he dies. And at this point, the story takes a veer, because at that point, the magician Ruel, who Christians would know best as Jethro, but in the Jewish tradition, he's known as Ruel. We'll call him Jethro because it's easier for people to understand who he is. He's the father-in-law of Moses. Anyway, Jethro steals the sapphire rod, goes off with it to his homeland in Midian, which is somewhere in Saudi Arabia near Jordan. It's an oasis, and he keeps it there. And then Moses, when he leaves Egypt, goes to Midian, and there he encounters Zipporah, who is his wife-to-be and the daughter of Jethro. They fall in love, and everything's fine. But then in the myth, suddenly Jethro turns against and seeks to kill Moses by throwing him into a pit, reminiscent of the pit that Joseph himself was thrown into. And he thinks, Jethro thinks that Moses is dead, but unbeknownst to Jethro, Zipporah would go to the pit each day and drop down food and take care of him that way. Years would go by, and then suddenly, one day, she reveals to her father that, oh, he's not dead, he's in the pit. And so Jethro thinks, oh, wow, that's quite amazing that he's still alive after all this time. And so he says, bring him up. And Jethro had put the sapphire rod in his garden. And it was fixed into the garden. And he said to anybody who can withdraw this sapphire from the ground will have my daughter as their reward. Other suitors had come, and when they went and touched the sapphire rod, they vanished. In other words, they just disappeared. And so Jethro kind of thought, oh, well, we'll let Moses go in there and he'll disappear too, which is because there's probably pits related to this. At any case, Moses, being trained as a magician, understood, as Jethro was trained as a magician in Egypt, understood what was happening, and he was able to go in there and just take out the sapphire rod without disappearing. And that's at that point, it is at this point that the sapphire rod comes into the proper person, who is Moses, who is the son of Joseph. That's the story in Jewish folklore. As it's told in the Bible, Moses is a descendant of Levi. And we go in to explain that this is not possible. The problem is that Jethro is the son of Asa. Asa is the first born son of Isaac. That means and Isaac was the founder of the Jews. and they were twins, and the younger son was Jacob. Now, Jacob, in the end, persuaded by his mother, impersonates Esau when the blessing is being given, and he usurps the role that should go to Esau. Now, Esau had 3 wives, and his second wife was Basemath, who was the daughter of Ishmael, the founder of the Arabs. They only had one child, and that was Jethro. Jethro is the first person to be descended to Abraham through both the founder of the Arabs, Ishmael, and the founder of the Jews, Isaac. So he had a very high opinion of his own bloodline. And that sort of sets up a lot of the dynamics that we believe were going on in the Torah.
Now, when we explore this, too, it's really fascinating as you begin your book, first of all, to realize a couple of things. Sigmund Freud actually spent the last 40 years of his life researching to try to prove that Moses, in fact, was replaced by an imposter, that he was, in fact, murdered. And then you also talk a lot about magic or the magicians in Egypt. Now, what's really unique for the listeners to know about this is, first of all, anybody who has actually looked into Egyptian history well enough will realize they had many gods that they had involved in their religion. And also things such as hypnotism and magic, if you will, were actually real practices, not like today that we tend to use them for entertainment, for deception and sleight of hand, but, actual ways of rituals of what I believe of connecting with the natural world to understand its natural laws, much like in Chinese, the Tao, for instance. Does that kind of make sense?
It does to me,
okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And so when you think about that and the idea of hypnotism and even the idea of prayer, when you talk to people this day and age, most people will say, well, prayer is when you sit there, you bow your head, and you talk to God. But prayer back in those days, which was much different. Let's go ahead and talk about, for instance, the Egyptian way and the fact that, as you talk about in your book, that Moses, at least the original guy, was actually not only of Egyptian descent instead of Hebrew, for instance, as the movie The Ten Commandments depicts, but he was also a great warrior. Now, in the Ten Commandments, this is just some guy running around with some great long hair and a beard and a robe with a staff. Whereas here it seems in Egypt he was not only, a war hero, but also, was one of those that took down Ethiopia, for instance, and protected Egypt from that. So let's go ahead and talk about that, because I found that is not only unique, but it leaves people scratching their head. Okay, well, if we're removing this part of Moses, well, what about the miracle parts, things like the Red Sea? And we'll go ahead and get into that a little bit later, but let's go ahead and start there with, the magic of Egypt, the multiple gods, and here was Moses of Egyptian bloodline.
Yes, well, because we believe we differ with Freud on the issue of the parents of Moses. Freud believed that Moses was an Egyptian, full-blooded Egyptian. We, however, believe that his father was Joseph. That makes him half Hebrew. And his mother was Asenath. Now, she was a priestess in Heliopolis, which the Bible calls On. And that was one of the most sacred places in Egypt. And her father was the high priest of Heliopolis. And the high priest of Heliopolis, incidentally, was the chief astronomer for all of Egypt. So really, really inside job here. So when, as he grew up, and we believe that Moses was born after Joseph had been murdered, and that's why he was given the name Oserseph, which we can go into later. But I think your idea of going into what they were teaching. The sleep temples, they had sleep temples where people would come and meditate and the priests would give suggestions to them, very hypnotic suggestions to them, and cure a lot of the mental illnesses that were going on. And this was going on for centuries and centuries and centuries. By the time of Moses, it was well established. The priests were the magicians, and the difference between a magician and a priest in Egypt was simply who you served. If you served the royal family, then you were a priest. But if you were serving somebody else, like giving an amulet to somebody to protect them from demons, you're invoking the same gods, you're invoking the same rituals, you're doing exactly the same. It's really just that basically the magician is a priest in private practice, doing it for people around him. And so you get things like earrings, for example, were given to deflect demons because it was believed that the ear was a sensitive way in which demons might enter into the spirit of people. So if you put earrings on, the demons were considered to be sort of easily fooled in a sense, and so they would be attracted to the earring rather than to the ear. Mm-hmm. Likewise with they would do tattoos as well. These would be protections as well, and amulets around their neck, sometimes through their nose. These are because again the nose was also considered, and the mouth were considered vulnerable to demons. Even today we have that Gesundheit, when you sneeze, and that goes back to the idea is when you sneeze, you're vulnerable to a demon entering, and that's why people say bless you,
right,
against the demon from going.
And I wanted to point out too, when I was reading that part about the earrings, I didn't quite catch the nose part, and you look back at Egyptians, the earrings then were very flamboyant, like miniature shields. Yeah. Versus, the kind of hoop stuff and, the studded stuff we see today, it's more for fashion. But it's always intriguing that. And you also talk about tattoos as well. And you realize it's really kind of unique. But no, it ain't kind of. It is wonderfully unique when you read about the historical, I guess, necessity, for lack of a better word, for how earrings or maybe even tattoos came to be, rather than just, this is cool to get the skull and the crossbones, on my arm that says Mom, stuff like that.
Serious, not a joke at all. Absolutely, and puppetry too is very interesting too. And we'll get to Ethiopia and the war with Balaam in a moment, but just to mention for a second, puppetry was very serious because in Ethiopia, when in one of the periods just prior to the Moses, if there was no clear succession for the pharaoh, the priests would line up, and each of them would have something, and one of them would be holding a pole, and on the top of the pole was a bird, a sacred bird, and inside the pole was a string, so you couldn't see that. And as the candidates to who might become pharaoh are passing in front of the priest holding the pole with the significant bird on the top will pull that, and the bird nods, and that makes that person the next pharaoh. So now this is not toy puppetry. This is like political power being used, puppetry being used for political power. We also mentioned that later in the story of Moses, we can get into the man-made puppet, but I think you're interested primarily in what happened in Ethiopia. So the problem was there was a bad king, and he had a nasty magician named Balaam. And Moses was tasked. None of the Egyptian generals were able to conquer this place. Couldn't get in. The Balaam had surrounded the whole area with poisonous snakes, and so they couldn't even get there. And so they were claiming to be the new rulers, and so the Pharaoh says, well, let's send Moses down there to do this. And Moses goes down, and on his way he collects all these birds that eat snakes. And each one of his people have these. And when they get to the area where they shouldn't be able to get into to the fortress, they let load the birds, let the birds go and eat the snakes, and it clears the path. Up in the tower, looking down upon this is this Ethiopian princess, and she falls in love with Moses. And incidentally, one of the things that's common throughout the whole story of Moses, particularly when you get into Jewish folklore, is how handsome he is. Like his father, he was very similar to his father. Joseph was considered really, really handsome. And so she fell in love with him just by sight, and then she lets him in, and they conquer, and that ends it. Balaam and his sons have to take off, and so that was a victorious way of taking over. So he used his knowledge of nature and also his charm to, with the women, this woman, to be able to break into the fortress and have this great victory. All of this is not included. None of this is included in the Bible, although it is included in Josephus' account of the history of the Jews.
Now, I was thinking too, especially when I came to you get to the part of this whole story here. For instance, when you were talking about Moses basically being, the war hero for Egypt, there was a movie back in 2014, I believe it was, starring Christian Bale, Exodus, Gods and Kings. And what was really unique about how the movie lays out is, first of all, you see Moses as a warrior in this, okay, played by Christian Bale. But also when it came to them leaving, the Exodus, if you will, things like, for instance, the parting of the Red Sea, what you see in this movie is him kind of looking at the skies and going, you know what? I know this is what is about to happen, so here's our opportunity to get out of Dodge, so to speak. And not that we want to jump into that real quick here, but so let's talk about the motivation of Jethro and why it was really unique why Moses was actually sent back to Egypt, and it was actually because Jethro, through his magician's ways, was telling him, you need to do this, because basically he was really trying to reclaim the Israelites, to be their leader, but the only way he could do that was through the bones of Joseph. Now let's go ahead and talk about that.
Sure. Of course, the story occurs when Moses is out with the sheep in the far side of town, of the desert rather, and he goes into this mountain and he sees this burning bush, and from the burning bush comes a voice, and he has this exchange with him, which is very peculiar. In the end, he's told that his job, he is going. First of all, he declines the opportunity to be God's emissary. He just doesn't think he's worthwhile. He says, I stutter. Freud thought his stutter was related to the fact that he was raised as an Egyptian and only knew Hebrew second hand, so that he was speaking in a second tongue and felt that he wasn't eloquent enough to be able to speak to the people. And then Yahweh inside the burning bush says, well, no problem, here's Aaron. He's your older brother, and he's quite eloquent, and so he can come with you. Strange thing is, this is the first reference to Aaron. Moses is supposed to be like 80 or something, and then suddenly we find out, oh, hey, by the way, he's got a brother who can speak eloquently.
Which, to let the listeners know, too, makes it unique, because now here we see, well, is it possible some scholars came in here and kept changing the story over the years?
Well, yeah. Well, we felt in those times, because a part of Egyptian magicians' training, there was the belief, and it was pretty widespread amongst magicians, that if you possessed the skull of a deceased prophet, that you could use that skull to summon demons to do your bidding. This was the belief. Now, Ruel, or Jethro, pretending to be Yahweh, in our view, using hypnotism. This is a hypnotic suggestion. When he says to him, "Take off your shoes," the land stand where you stand is sacred ground. That goes back to the whole training that Moses had with Jethro, because Jethro was his mentor. So, off problem that Jethro had was he didn't know where Joseph's bones were buried, because the Egyptians were very good at hiding the bodies of their deceased, and so Jethro needed Moses, who was the son of Joseph, and we can go into the reasons for that, to be able to go to Egypt and have an audience with the Pharaoh, which was really, in Jewish folklore, they have a real problem about this idea of Moses and Aaron just walking into the Pharaoh's palace and being able to have an audience. I mean, that was not people's experience of where you couldn't just do that. But that's not the case for an Egyptian-trained magician like Moses.
Right.
He knew the Pharaoh. He knew the procedures. He looked like an Egyptian. He spoke like an Egyptian. He could get in there, and more importantly, because Joseph was his father, he could find the location of Joseph's bones. And so in the course of events, he does recover Joseph's bones, and they come back to Moses carries Joseph's bones out of Egypt. In the Bible, there is no close relationship between Joseph and Moses. There has been what we would call a smokescreen of 430 years separating them. The Levites didn't want the Levites wanted Moses to be a Levite, even though he wasn't, and so they invented this 430 years of bondage to separate time. But if you go back to like the sapphire rod, for example, it assumes there's no time difference between Moses and Joseph. And the Roman sources, when you look into the Roman sources, they say blatantly right out there that Moses was the third son of Joseph, born, and it's in this case after Joseph was dead, so he's the widow's son. So he was able to get to Egypt, and he was able to ask the Egyptian authorities, look, I've come back. I want to get my father's bones and take them and bury them in what we consider our Holy Land. The Egyptians say, sure, that's a natural thing. We expect that the son would want to take care of the bones of the father. No problem. So then he goes back with and Jethro then takes of Joseph's bones.
So now you enter the story, obviously, of Exodus, and this was the idea that the Pharaoh was saying, okay, let's go ahead and lead these people out of Egypt. But there was really something much more simpler than all that as far as an explanation goes, isn't there?
We don't believe that there was a great exodus out, and archaeology certainly doesn't confirm that, even though archaeology as a science was founded with the very purpose of discovering evidence for the Exodus. So people have been looking for evidence for the Exodus for ever since archaeology was invented. And if you read things like The Bible Unearthed by Israeli archaeologists, they deny that there was any great vast exodus. And we don't think that there was either. However, there was people who were being expelled from Egypt simply because it was a time of drought. And the Egyptians decided, well, we're having enough trouble taking care of ourselves, so some people are expelled.
Right, because, you're basically out in the desert, and sometimes you have those droughts. Anybody who's lived in the southwestern part of the United States would go, that story makes a lot more sense.
Yes, and the thing about the drought is that that's one thing that really does help to sort of date what was going on, because we do know when the droughts were occurring in the Middle East in those times. And it was around the time of Ramses II. There was a lot of droughts going on, and the people in Canaan were really experiencing the droughts, and that was one of the reasons that Israel's sons had to go to Egypt to find corn. And when they get there, the brother that they had sold into slavery, the brother Joseph, who Joseph is just such an incredibly wonderful character, and the most full-fleshed character, far more elaborated than Moses is. Joseph has, exactly who he is, what he was about. He was a dreamer. He felt that he said that the other brothers, or his older brothers, would bow down to him at some time, and then they get really angry with him and they put him in a pit. And then Reuben, the oldest of Israel's sons, said, well, we shouldn't really kill him. And then Judah says, well, let's sell him. And so they sell him into slavery, and he goes to Egypt as a slave. And for a while, he's doing very well because his master really takes a liking to him and starts to give him more and more authority. Unfortunately for Joseph, he's so handsome, and his master's wife sort of falls for him and is always trying to seduce him. And Joseph is just, no way. I'm with God. I'm not doing that. I wouldn't do that. So then she actually frames him, grabs one of his piece of his clothes, and then says to her husband, "Oh, he raped me," and which is probably not true at all. And so then Joseph is thrown into prison. So now here you're really at the low point. You're a slave in prison. That's pretty low. But this guy you can't stop this guy. He befriends the warden. He then is able to start to create order in the prison. He tells the people that are about to be executed, don't worry, you'll be saved at the last minute. Just keep order, you'll be fine. And so, and the people who are executed, of course, can't complain, but the people who are saved, like the butler to the Pharaoh, they remember, wow, this guy's great. He said I was going to be saved at the last minute, and I was. So then this butler goes to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh is having the problem of having these dreams that he can't interpret. So the butler says, because Joseph had said, gave him an auto-suggestion. He said, when things are good for you, think of me. And so the butler says, hey, there's a guy in the prison who is, really good at this dream interpretation thing. He predicted that I would be saved at the last minute, and I was. So the Pharaoh says, okay, bring him. And up he comes, and then not too long after that, Joseph has charmed the Pharaoh and has become the governor of the most important province on the eastern side of Egypt, where everybody coming from Canaan first has to come through. So Joseph is this incredibly important character. When when they had thrown him in the pit, Joseph, they told Israel, their father, oh, he had been killed by somebody, and this is his coat. It's all covered with blood, and it was just sheep's blood. But then Israel was just devastated. Because Joseph was the first son of his beloved Rachel. Israel had labored with his father-in-law Laban for 7 years to be able to have Rachel as his wife. So he worked for 7 years for free just so that he could have Rachel. But on the night that Rachel is supposed to be given to him, Laban throws this big party, gets Israel drunk, and Israel goes in, and then rather than sending in Rachel, they send in her older sister, Leah. Now, Leah impersonates, this is another case of impersonation. Leah impersonates Rachel. Israel consummates the marriage, and in the morning he realizes that it's Leah, not Rachel, and Laban says, well, where from here, the older has to be served first rather than the younger. You have to serve another 7 years. So that's the other part of the story, is that he serves another 40. So when finally Rachel does have a child, Israel just dotes on him. Joseph is just everything. And when Joseph is then believed to be dead, when his sons lie to him and say that he's dead, then he just is in despair. Then Rachel has another child, Benjamin, and she dies giving birth to him. So now it's Benjamin is the apple of Israel's eye. So when the children of Israel, seeking food from the drought, go into Egypt, they encounter the governor of this eastern province, who they don't know is Joseph, and he pretends that he can't speak Hebrew. Gets everything translated for him. And so he impersonates, there's another impersonation. He's impersonating an Egyptian governor. So this whole thing gets really out of hand when they say, when Joseph finally realizes that he has a brother, a real brother, a full brother, because all his other older brothers, who are much older than him, Reuben and Simon and Judah, and Levi, of course, are all older much older than Joseph. So when they come, he thinks, okay, now what should I do with them? And he sort of plays this game with them of not telling them who he is. And he says, oh, I want you to go back to Canaan, and I want you to bring Benjamin with you. And if you don't bring Benjamin with you, there'll be a problem, because I'm going to keep Simeon, who the second son of Israel, as a hostage. Just to give the background on that, Levi was sort of a very brains of the outfit, and Simeon was the brawn. And it was likely Simon that, and certainly in Jewish folklore it is, who throws Joseph into the pit. So Joseph says, I'm going to keep Simeon here in prison until you bring Benjamin back with you. So they go back. Get there. Israel says, no way am I sending my precious only son of Rachel, who has died in giving birth to him, to go back to go back to Egypt with you guys, who I kind of don't trust, because I never really was sure what happened to Joseph. So they played with him, and and time goes by, and they're saying, oh my gosh, we could have been back there by 2 times by now, and they're all afraid that Simeon has died of starvation, because Joseph said, I'm throwing him in the dungeon, and he's going to be down there, no food or water. He's just going to be down there. You got to get back here with Benjamin. So when they get back this time with Benjamin, they finally get back with Benjamin. Joseph throws this big party, and he tests them. And he also tests them with by planting. They really gives all sorts of good things to Benjamin, and they're kind of the children of Israel are kind of baffled that this Egyptian government is even asking him to eat with them, because that's just was unheard of, let alone to give them all sorts of treasures and stuff. And so to test them further, Joseph plants a vase in Benjamin's camel, and lets them all go, and then they're all heading back there with the corn, and they're thinking everything's going to be fine now, we're going back. But then, wham, out comes the Egyptian army in their chariots, and they arrive, and they say, something has been stolen, we have to do something about this, we have to check you guys out. And they're not Levi, and they say, well, no. Judah says, no problem. We're not thieves. Check us. Go search everywhere. And it's lo and behold, they find this vase. And now Judah and Reuben and Levi are really worried, because, now they know, oh my gosh, they're going to take Benjamin and they're going to kill him. And then what will our father do then? Our father will just not if he loses his second son by Rachel. So they go back. They have another incredible feast, and all the time Joseph is using an interpreter so that he has time to think about all of the responses. And finally, Reuben said, "Oh, we had this other brother, and I feel really guilty about it. I shouldn't have done what we did to him." And so Joseph thinks, okay, yeah, you're okay. And then Judah says, look, I cannot go back to my father without Benjamin, because I promised him on the life of my sons that I would bring him back. And I know that my father could not take it if we went back. So at that point, Joseph breaks down and cries and says, and he takes off his costume. He says, it is me, it's Joseph. And they're all completely amazed. So that's when they all get really big lots of stuff to come. It says, let's go back, and Joseph says, let's go back to Canaan and collect our rest of the children of Israel, not to mention Israel himself, and we'll bring him to Egypt and give him good land and everything. So now here's where the story gets really kind of suspicious. When Joseph eventually meets up with Israel, the Bible has no references of what was said between them. Now surely Joseph would have said to his father, it was Levi and Simon Simeon who put me in the pit. Reuben's okay because he felt guilty about it, and Judah is very good because he was willing to die rather than go back for guilt that he felt about what had happened to Joseph. So clearly Israel knew what had happened, but that the Bible never mentions anything about that. It's just kind of suppressed. The thing about it is that now we come to Israel's last will and testament. And he says to Reuben, you're just fickle. You were the oldest son. You should have been. In the Bible, it said that Reuben had slept with one of Israel's concubines, and that was the reason why he was disinherited. But that's just a cover story. The real reason that Reuben was disinherited, in our view, in the way we put it in the murder of Moses, is that he had not shown leadership. He had not shown the leadership of the first son that he should have been, so he was disinherited. Then Israel disinherits Levi and Simeon. Now, we believe that Simeon was dead by this time, and the evidence is pretty clear because Simeon, when they eventually do get to the Promised Land, there's no land for Simeon. He has to make do with living under Judah's authority. That is the tribe, not him. He himself is dead, we believe. And when Moses comes down in Deuteronomy, when Moses comes down to speak to all the tribes, all the children of Israel, he first says, "Oh, Reuben, I hope he gets well. He's sick, but he can't be here. But that's too bad. But he's not dead." Now, in the Bible, he's supposed to have been dead for 430 years in the other parts, but in Deuteronomy, he's not dead. And then he turns to Levi, and he really sort of takes it to Levi and says, "You're the one who lied to our father about what had happened," and so there's clearly a disinheritance there. So, and not only are the first three sons of Israel disinherited, but also Benjamin by this time also has not found favor. So you have these characters, Levi and Benjamin, who are outcasts, or Israel, especially, outlaws them. And so they are in dire need of a new identity. And that's what Ruel does. He gives them a new identity. So Levi becomes Aaron. Benjamin becomes Joshua. And Levi's sister, who had Dinah, becomes Miriam, the prophetess. This is our interpretation of what's happening in the story as we go through. And all those things are consistent with what happens with Aaron and Miriam and Benjamin as being the same characters with new identities.
Kind of amazing how you look back at these stories and you realize, well, geez, we haven't really evolved too much because we're doing a lot of the same things today.
Yeah.
But even more fascinating, too, is when you take a look at the contrast between the Egyptians and the Israelites and the idea of Moses is that you look at a lot of indigenous cultures around the world, especially the earlier indigenous cultures, whether they be the Native Americans of North America or South America, and they had an idea of, let's say, many gods, whereas in this particular situation, this was the birth of monotheism, the idea of one God. And it's pretty incredible that it's sort of like taking the power that you have perhaps as a magician and saying, okay, let's see how we can convince these people. Let's just pray to one person, whereas in the case of Jethro, it was Yahweh, or mountain god. And, the idea of this is the direction we want to go, because what he's really trying to do is reclaim his leadership role, isn't he?
Yes.
What he believes to be his birthright that he was cheated out of.
Exactly. That's certainly our thesis, is that Jethro was cheated out of his birthright by an act of impersonation by Israel, and so he wanted to reclaim that.
Now, what's really unique is as people go back, if they have seen the Ten Commandments, and then there's when he's up on the mountain, he's getting the messages from God and literally the Ten Commandments. And then you take a look at, for instance, geology and time, and the idea that these were areas that were allegedly volcanic, and a lot of lightning on the mountaintops. And so when you see this depicted in the Cecil B. DeMille movie of, here's God striking and thou shalt not do this, and you think, okay, well, if you use a little bit of science, okay, basically here's somebody up on a mountain full of lightning strikes.
Yeah,
so.
Certainly. When you, and one of I'd like to say a little bit about my research methodology for a second, because, like, some of the listeners might be interested in how I go about a research. The way I approach a problem, first of all, I have to be interested. I have to be curious because of something that doesn't fit, an anomaly of some sort. In the case of the sons who were incinerated because they dared to try to look at what was in the ark, that was the thing that carried me in. But the thing that I do when I'm researching is, first of all, I try to get a good history of what is going on. And Jonathan Kirsch's history of the Moses story is very good. And what I do then is I try to identify the key thinkers and find out what they can't explain. And one of the key thinkers, and I certainly think he's probably the most important biblical scholar living, is Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote the Bible, but he also wrote a commentary on the Torah. And there's this one passage that he found to be completely baffling, and that is the story of the incident at the inn. And Richard Elliott says, no one knows what the episode at the lodging place means. So when I looked, that's the kind of thing I'm looking for. I'm looking for what are the leading thinkers in the field unable to explain. And here is something that Richard Elliott Friedman is unable to explain. And also Martin Noth, who was kind of the most important German biblical scholar of the 20th century. He also was completely baffled about this whole incident. And it's very, very short. And then I'd like to read it, because since Richard Elliott Friedman cannot explain it, I want to be able to show that in the murder of Moses that it is completely coherent. It's not an impossible thing. So it's a very short passage, and it reads, "And it came to pass by the way of the inn that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet and said, Surely a bloody husband art thou to me. So let him go. And then she said, A bloody husband thou art because of the circumcision." So we ask, why did this speedy circumcision of the boy satisfy the enraged Lord? And why, if this is the universe, the creator of the universe, is he incapable of killing Moses? Which is because, he's not able to do it. He sought to kill him, but he doesn't do it. When you look into the folklore explicitly links this with Jethro. And says that it's Jethro, not the Lord, that is who's there seeking to prevent Moses escaping to Egypt with his son, and not because his. And I'll just get right to what that says in the folklore is that Jethro made it a condition that one half of his children should be Israelite, the other Egyptian. Now, Egyptians had circumcised at the age of puberty, whereas for the Jews, it was the 8th day after birth. So this is the child that Moses had taken. His wife Zipporah and one of their children, their younger second son, and was headed off to Egypt on this task of trying to get Joseph's bones. And so the thing that's interesting here is that isn't inexplicable, because Jethro was trying perfect bloodline. He himself saw himself as the most noble bloodline because he was the first person who could trace his ancestry to Abraham through both the Arabs and the Jews. He needed to have Moses in his family because Joseph was the one member of the children of Israel who he didn't have in his bloodline. So that's why he wanted Moses to marry Zipporah. And their children then became the prize, which is the children of Moses had the blood of all of the most important patriarchs, Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Israel, all of the children of Israel have in some way, one way or another, got into the bloodline. And so these children were the things that he was trying to predict. As we write it here, this, we suggest, is not the tale of a supernatural force. It is the story of a grandfather protecting his prized bloodline. It is the story of a breeder of people protecting his investment.
Mm-hmm.
So, in our view, that whole incident at the end, far from being nobody can understand it, as Richard Elliott Friedman says, is actually quite coherent as we present the story in The Murder of Moses.
You know, and it all makes sense when you step back, and people may be listening at this point thinking, okay, what is this all about? I think in its simplicity, it's simply this. So you see people who see themselves as a different type of people, a different tribe, if you will, against Egypt. So Egypt has their way of doing things. You know, they've got their gods and their practices and so forth. And here's these people feeling, okay, but we're also in and of ourselves. For instance, they were doing pretty well, you know, under Egyptian rule, if you will, according to what you wrote, serving Egypt. But they were like, nah, we want something more. And they got out of there and they went to Canaan, where they actually thrived accordingly. And with the last minute or two that we have here. So what you see is then, to me, is this group of people saying, we want to go ahead and create our own God in our own ways and kind of go off and figure out life for ourselves. And I know that seems like it's oversimplifying it, but doesn't that make sense?
Yeah, it certainly does, yes. Mm-hmm. And I guess the one other thing I would say, and the thing that Freud emphasized so much and was unable to prove, is that it was Akhenaten, the pharaoh, who had first put forward the idea of monotheism, and because he was discredited among the Egyptians, that became a secret society among the priests of Heliopolis. Mm-hmm. And since the pharaoh gave Asenath, the priestess of Heliopolis, as the wife to Joseph, when Moses was born after Joseph was dead and was raised by his mother and his grandfather, he was given the secret of monotheism, and then took that from Egypt when he went to join Jethro in Jethro's oasis.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, it is a wonderful story, as like I said earlier, meeting and talking with Jonathan Kirsch, and this was back in the early part of 2000, and as well as Bruce Feiler and Walking the Bible. For the listeners out there, if you're interested on things like the Red Sea and the food and the birds falling from the sky, read The Murder of Moses definitely, so you can see how these magicians, if you will, really knew the lay of the land. They knew natural phenomenon. It was pretty amazing, and you'll discover why these things occurred, but not in ways that people who were starving were saying, wow, these are miracles. Of course, when you're starving and you get food, you don't have to make much of an effort, it seems, for it. You're going to think, boy, that was a miracle.
Yeah, like the birds falling from the sky.
Right, yeah. And it was fun to listen to Bruce Feiler explain some of these things. And I think, for the listeners out there, pick up a copy of The Murder of Moses as you talk about these things as well. But it's, it's a fascinating and rich history, and it kind of gives, like I said, it gives you an idea that sometimes there's a group of people within a group that just simply say, we've got to kind of go on our way and figure things out for ourselves. And really, so then there becomes this, legend that becomes myth. So then that way it keeps that concentrated group in a belief system to continue it on, which makes a lot of sense, when you think about it in the history of humanity. Rand, first of all, thank you for being on the program today. And is there a website and a way that people can find out more about your work and picking up The Murder of Moses?
I don't really have a website anymore. If you need to contact me, the Murder of Moses at Gmail will get messages to us. I'm not really into very much self-promotion.
I gotcha.
I'm a publisher's nightmare, if you want.
Understood. We've got other projects to do, right?
Yes, exactly. I'm interested in finding things, not...
Yeah, I get it, too.
Yeah.
Again, the book is The Murder of Moses. It's how an Egyptian magician assassinated Moses, stole his identity, and hijacked the Exodus. Our guest today, Rand Flemmott. Rand, thank you for being on the Beyond 50 radio program. I look forward to reading the rest of the book. It was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and you were a great host, letting me tell the story, and I really appreciate the way you led the conversation.
Well, I appreciate having you again, and it was, again, a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We want to thank you, the listeners, today for joining us here on the program. If you feel like you want to be led, there's a direction you can go, which is beyond50radio.com, our website. You can sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. Stay up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.